What's up, y'all? Welcome back. I have a confession to make. I've never been good at making meatballs. Every time I've made them, they come out dry, crumbly, and honestly terrible. But recently I've taken another stab at it with ground chicken, and they came out ultra tender and flavorful. So, with this newfound skill, I've paired them with pasta dressed with homemade mortar and pestle pesto, and what I've come up with is a really tasty, vibrant, and fresh dinner for the warm summer months. So, let me show you how I do it. The first step today is going to be the pesto. For that, I'm going to start with a couple cloves of garlic that I'll smash and peel, and I'll throw those into the mortar and pestle with a pinch of kosher salt. We're going to need to season this at some point, and the salt will add abrasiveness, which will make the job of breaking down the garlic much easier. Once it looks about like that, I'm going to add some pine nuts. I'm not measuring here, but I'll guess and say I added about a third of a cup. You can toast these if you want, but people on the internet who are smarter than me say it doesn't make a difference, so I don't bother. I'm gonna work those over until it's a pretty smooth paste, kinda like that. Now it's time for the basil. I have 2 of those plastic grocery store clamshells worth of it here, but honestly it's hard to hit the upper limit on how much you can use for this. So really, unless you have just an obscene amount of basil laying around for some reason, I would say whatever you have, go ahead and throw it in. I'm just going one handful at a time and breaking it down as much as I can each time before introducing more. When you're using a mortar and pestle, you want to get a good pound going, but you also want a little bit of a grinding action at the same time. So don't pound straight down, aim for the curvature between the sides of the mortar and pestle and the bottom, and that should work out best. Each addition of basil takes a minute or 2 for me to work in there, and I'm not trying to pulverize it into a perfect paste at this point, just broken down enough to where I don't see any big visible leaf bits. The last bit of basil there I'm going to save for the meatballs, so this is going to be my last addition. Once all of the basil is in and broken down into the mixture, it's time for my next ingredient, which will be Parmesan cheese. I'm going to grate this on the microplane. Getting it nice and fine will just make it easier to incorporate. I am truly unsure of how much I'm doing here. Sorry, but I just never measure this stuff. A pile of this size looks about right to me, definitely less than the basil. I'll add that to the mortar, and while I'm at it, I'll grind in some black pepper as well. This really shouldn't take long to get worked in there. There's not a lot of breaking down that needs to occur at this point. Once it looks reasonably homogeneous, kind of like that, it's time for my last ingredient, which will be olive oil. You're really going to taste it here, so make sure you use something that you enjoy eating raw. I'm adding a couple tablespoons at a time and working it in basically until you can't see it anymore, and then adding some more. I'm not sure if I'd call this an emulsion or if it's just being absorbed by all the plant matter in there. Either way, best to mix it in small increments so it's easier to assess how much you need. Here I added probably a little over a quarter of a cup, and this looks about right to me. Make sure you taste it and adjust it for seasoning if needed, and with that, it's ready to go. Okay, next up, the meatballs. The first step is to make the panade, which basically consists of breadcrumbs and all the wet stuff. I'm starting with about half a cup of panko breadcrumbs. Why panko? Well, because that's what I had when I first tried this recipe and it worked, so now I don't want to change it. But I think the panko maybe keeps things a little lighter and fluffier than regular breadcrumbs. Let me know in the comments if you think I'm wrong though. I really have no idea other than I know this works. Next in is 1 egg and about a quarter cup of milk. I'm using oat milk today because that's what I had, but use whatever you got. I also like to add my vegetable matter at this point because they too have moisture, so I'm gonna add 3 cloves of finely minced garlic and 1 shallot that I will also finely dice. I don't really want these to play into the texture so much, so a fine dice is pretty key for me. A big pinch of salt will help draw moisture out of the shallot and the garlic that can soak into those breadcrumbs, and I'll also do a few cranks of black pepper for good measure. So now it's time to mix this up, and the name of the game here, for me at least, is getting the breadcrumbs to soak up as much liquid as possible. The more liquid I get in there now, the more tender the meatballs are going to be later, so whenever it looks like it could handle a little more, I'll stop and give it an extra splash of milk. During the mixing here, I added probably another 2 or 3 tablespoons. That looks good to me there, so now I want to let that rest for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. The rest will give the breadcrumbs time to fully saturate all the way through, which again will make the end result more tender. While I wait, I'll grate some more Parmesan that I'll add later, and I'll also go ahead and chop up this reserved basil. You could add other herbs here as well. Parsley and oregano would be pretty obvious and delicious additions, but I'll keep it simple today. Other cool things you could add would be carrot if you want some texture, lemon zest would be nice, some kind of spicy pepper. If it sounds like it would be good, it probably will be, so go crazy. Alright, about 10 minutes later here, my panade is rested, so I'll go ahead and add my cheese and basil, and then it's time for the meat. I have a pound of ground chicken here, and to start, I'm going to add about a third of it. With this third of the meat, I'm going to mix everything really well, which will extract some of the proteins in the meat and get everything sticky and bound together, kind of like how you would make a sausage. We need some of that so the meatballs hold together, but too much and we'll lose more tenderness than I'd like. So just a third for now, and once that's really well incorporated, I'll add the rest of the meat and be a little bit more gentle about it. Here, I just want to do enough so it's fairly homogeneous, and then stop. This looks about right to me. So now, all that's left is to shape these. You can do any size you like. I like to keep them in the 2 to 3 bite range. What's more important than the size you choose is that you make them all the same size. I was trying to be economical here on dishes by putting the balls back in the same bowl, but that's dumb, don't do that. I ended up taking them out and reshaping them on a plate anyways. One thing that does help is to get your hands wet. The balls will stick less and you'll be able to get them smoother. Once those are rolled out, I'll come over to the stove where I'll place a stainless steel skillet on medium-high heat, and then I'll add a couple tablespoons of oil. A good amount of oil is going to be key here to get proper browning on the meatballs. Once that's nice and hot, I'll start searing these. I'm going to do half of them at a time since I don't want to overcrowd the pan. Really, just a couple minutes per side should do it. I'm not worried about cooking these all the way through right now, we're just focused on the browning. I'm going to try and get 3 solid sides of browning on each of these. I think that'll be enough. If you try to turn them and they stick, just give them another minute and they should release from the pan pretty easily. If you want full coverage with the browning, you could deep fry these, but honestly, I think that's more work than it's worth. Once these are browned, I'll fish them out and set them aside, and then I'm going to build my braising liquid right in this pan where I'm going to finish them. That's going to start with some cherry tomatoes and just enough chicken stock to deglaze the pan. Cherry tomatoes are super convenient to me and tend to be higher quality than bigger varieties at the supermarket, so that's what I tend to reach for these days. I'm going to put the lid on these and cook them until the skins burst and they start to break down, kind of like this. These took around 5 minutes to get to this point. I'll help them along by squishing them with a spatula now, which should be pretty easy, and then I'll add another cup or so of chicken stock, followed by a spoonful of my pesto from earlier. Depending on the salt content of the stock you use, you may need to add more, so go ahead and check for that at this point. Once it tastes good and comes up to a simmer, it's time to add the meatballs back in to finish cooking. I like to turn the heat all the way down to low so they get a nice and gentle poach. Now's a good time to start my pasta, so I'll get that going. I'm using gemelli today. Pesto is more traditionally served with a long noodle, but I like a little shape. And besides, there's not a whole lot that's traditional about this anyways. Once the pasta is done, I'll reserve a cup or so of the cooking water and then drain off the rest. Then I'll add the rest of my pesto and a little splash of the water. Pesto is not a sauce you want to cook really, so do this part off heat and only add enough water to emulsify everything and get creamy. This looks good to me, so I'll check back in on my meatballs, which should be done by now, and a thermometer confirms, so it's time to plate up. I'll start with a few scoops of pasta, followed by 3 meatballs. 2 would be more reasonable, but 3 looks better in my opinion. And then I'll spoon over just a touch of this braising liquid. With this one, you're gonna have a lot of braising liquid left. Might I suggest making some risotto and spooning it over that? It's really tasty stuff, so don't worry, it's pretty easy to not let it go to waste. And that's it. An extra dusting of Parmesan on top is nice if you remember, but even without it, this is a great little pasta dish. The meatballs are crazy tender, and I'm really stoked on how good those are because they've always been such a challenge for me. I hope you give it a try sometime, and if you do, let me know how it goes. Thanks.